Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Thank you. After the Random Review Committee finished their voting on the books this year, we discussed possible reviewers. When we got to In the Kingdom of Ice, more than one person said, let's ask John Byrne who he thinks would be good. You haven't heard the punchline yet. When we called him, his ever humble response was, me! Many of you know about John's illustrious professional career, including his 11 years as president at Oregon State. I'd like to share some additional things you may not know about him. John's early years were spent in a couple of small towns on Long Island, about 30 miles east of New York City. He and the neighborhood kids had a Norman Rockwell childhood, wearing knickers, playing in the streets, and roaming in the woods around their homes. It was there that he started his first paid job, at age 7 or 8, selling the Saturday Evening Post and Collier's magazine, door to door in the neighborhood. He was to be paid in baseball gloves and other baseball equipment, but since all his pals were doing the same thing, they rapidly ran out of customers, thus ending John's sales career. In the summer, just before high school, he and his parents moved to Chappaqua, then a small rural town. Their property was full of rocks and boulders. Besides helping his dad clear the fields and build rock walls, John became interested in why there were so many of them, where they came from, and how old they were, perhaps foretelling his later interest in geology. He went to Horace Greeley High School, where he played saxophone in the school band, graduating in 1946 in a class of 26. One musical highlight of his high school years was learning to sing the prologue to Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, to the tune of Darktown Strutter's Ball, which I'm sure you all remember. Next time you talk to him, maybe not today, but the next time you talk to him, he might even sing it if you ask him. He still can, because I've heard it.
Don't ask.
His daughter said, don't ask, but I think it's really fun. At about this time, he read a book that made a lasting impression on him. It was called Hell on Ice, The Saga of the Jeannette by Edward Ellsberg. His response to that book is one of the reasons he was eager to do today's review. John attended Hamilton College in Clinton, New York, intending to become a high school math teacher. As it turned out, his math grades were unimpressive, but he did manage to get an A in geology, so he changed his major and subsequently earned a master's degree in marine geology from Columbia University and a PhD from the University of Southern California. The rest is history. Well, almost. While at SC, he introduced himself to a cute co-ed named Shirley O'Connor. They've been married now for more than 61 years, raising 4 children, and now have 4 grandchildren. During John's 25-year tenure at Oregon State, he served as, long list, professor, then dean of oceanography, dean of research, graduate dean, and vice president for research and graduate studies. He also took 2 leaves of absence, one to serve as the program manager for oceanography at the National Science Foundation, and again as the administrator of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration before returning to OSU to be president in 1984. His scientific background and leadership skills give him a real understanding of the setting for today's book. Plus, his vision of what it looked like up there. This is a painting he did in the last couple of days. Isn't that fabulous? We'll put it up in the back so you can look at it better after we're done. Okay. He's experienced what it takes to lead people through uncharted waters, a theme that runs through the book he's going to talk about today. The Random Review Committee is pleased that he offered to do this review of In the Kingdom of Ice, the grand and terrible polar journey of the USS Jeannette. Before I welcome him into the room, we're going to draw the winning ticket.
Drum roll. Read the number, please.
3, 8. You know what? I bought Powerball tickets this morning. I'm so excited. This is not a Powerball. 3, 8, 3, 8, 6, 5, 5. There you go.
Yay, we have a winner.
Now for our reviewer, please join me in welcoming Dr. John Byrne.
It's 1879. 1879. No radio, no television, no computers. If you want to get from here to Portland, it'll take you 2 or 2.5 days. And that's by horse and buggy, or maybe even by the new steamboat that leaves from Corvallis. I'm looking for volunteers to go to the North Pole. We don't know what's going to happen yet, but we do want to go to the North Pole, and we're going to go on a ship called the Jeannette. How many of you who haven't read the book, have ever heard of the Jeannette? 3 of you. You should be ashamed. It's a major part of American history. And if you really want to know about it, there is a book we're going to review today. That's ice. That's not the book we're looking for. That's the wrong button, obviously. Now, here we go. Here we go.
Take off the goggles.
How many of you have read the book?
Good.
Okay, don't give away any of the secrets. I'm going to give you a little short course in oceanography before we start. It's all here in this book. And if you haven't read it, I'm going to make a case for you that I hope you will read it, and before we get finished here this afternoon.
Microphone.
This is the North Pacific Ocean. I think you're all aware of that. And the reason you have it up here is because, like the North Atlantic, the currents go in a clockwise direction. And as the water comes across the equator, it gets warmer. And so coming on up through here is a Japanese current called the Kuroshio. And they knew about this in 1879. And that current came on up here and it split. Part of it went through the Bering Sea, part of it came down along the coast of North America. Somebody got the idea, with that warm water coming up that way, some of it going through the Bering Sea might get up there into the Arctic Ocean and melt some of the ice. And at that time, they also thought that in the Arctic Ocean, there's the Bering Strait right there, that about this area right here was open ocean called a polar sea, a free polar sea. That for some reason the water was warm here, and as long as you could get through this ring of ice that went around it, you could sail easily right to the North Pole. No one had ever done that. But there were people who believed it. And it had been on the map as a polar free ocean for hundreds of years. And so there were a couple of people that said, well, maybe we can get to the North Pole by sailing up there. So let's see if we can do that. This is Hampton Sides. Hampton Sides was born in 1962, Memphis, Tennessee. Went to Yale, and he got a Bachelor of Arts degree in history. And then he got into journalism, and he has been very effective in his journalist career. He's written 6 books, writes for the National Geographic and so on. And like many of you, when he was on assignment to Norway, Shirley says I should be looking right here. When he was on assignment to Norway to study Fridtjof Nansen, an oceanographer and statesman and so on, they kept talking about the Jeannette and the Jeannette expedition. And he had never heard of it. And so he thought, well, I ought to find out about the Jeannette and the Jeannette expedition of 1879. And so he began to look into it, and he found that the skipper of the ship was a man named George Washington DeLong. And so he started chasing down the DeLongs. And he called a woman in Connecticut, and she said, "Oh, I'm so glad you called me. I have a trunk in the attic which is full of letters and all sorts of things from the DeLongs, from his wife Emma, and also from George Washington DeLong." And as Hampton Sides says, that's a treasure that any journalist would just really relish. So he got into it, and he decided, I've got to write a story, which turned out to be a book about the Jeannette expedition, sometimes called the DeLong expedition of 1879. That's Hampton Sides, and you can look him up. He's written several books that have been award winners and so on. The ship we're talking about is the USS Jeannette. Now, I'm going to get a little ahead of the story here. This vessel was originally christened as the Pandora. Now, who in his right mind would christen a ship Pandora? But they did. And so, ultimately, the ship was changed. This is supposed to be bad luck. If you didn't have enough bad luck with the Pandora, why, with that name, why simply changing the name of a ship during its lifetime is supposed to be bad luck. But in any case, it was named the Jeannette. It's 142 feet long, has a beam of 25 feet, that's the width of it, and when it's fully loaded, draws 13 feet of water, or at least it did. This is George DeLong, and I'm going to read you a little bit about him in a minute. But George DeLong, as the skipper of this vessel, was the one who found the Pandora. And he found it in England, and it was owned by a person at the time and who didn't want to sell it. The person changed his mind, and George DeLong had met this guy. This is James Gordon Bennett Jr., and because he has the same name as his father, they called him Gordon. He was the editor, owner, publisher, whatever you want to call it, of the New York Herald. He's the guy who sent Stanley over to find Livingston. He believed that newspapers should be entertaining as well as informative, and they would put stories in the paper that were untrue. And in the last paragraph, they would say, this was all fiction, as you of course realize. The most famous one, which is accounted for in Hampton's book, which I'll come back to in a second, was the animals escaping from the Central Park Zoo and running amok in Manhattan, chewing up people and all that sort of thing. And in the last paragraph it says, of course you realize this is not true, but by that time people had panicked, they were leaving town and all that sort of thing. But in any case, that's Gordon Bennett. And I need to tell you a little bit about Gordon Bennett. So I'm going to read from Hampton Sides' book. Now, Hampton Sides' book, In the Kingdom of Ice, has many stories in it. And Sides has very cleverly woven those stories together around the framework of the expedition. One of the stories is about the Gilded Age, the last 30 or 40 years of the 19th century. The term comes from a book that Mark Twain wrote. The Gilded Age is an age where there is corruption, there is all sorts of bad things happening, but on the surface it is gilded in gold and looks fine. But underneath, when you dig into it a little bit, it's not so fine. Well, he uses Bennett as an example of the Gilded Age. Gordon Bennett, as he was called in those days, was a very mischievous fellow. Let me just read something that Hampton Sides says about him. James Gordon Bennett Jr. was a tall, thin, regal man of 32 years with a trim mustache and fine tapering hands. His blue-gray eyes seemed cold and imperious, yet they also carried glints of mischief. Understatement. He wore impeccable French suits and dress shoes of supple Italian leather, and to facilitate his long, if erratic work hours, he kept a bed in his penthouse office in the Herald building. Bennett was also regarded as the third wealthiest man in New York City. He had very, very deep pockets. He was, by the people who worked with him, called Bennett the Terrible, the Mad Commodore, the autocrat of the transatlantic cables. One biographer wrote he saw himself as one of the lords of creation. Well, anyway, DeLong met this guy and said that DeLong would like to go to the Arctic and so on. Bennett thought that was a fabulous idea. Why don't we do that? I've got the money, find the ship, you buy the ship, you take care of the ship, and we'll get the United States Navy to sanction it and make it a United States naval vessel, and so on, which is, of course, what they did. In any case, DeLong and Bennett got along famously, and no matter what Bennett did, and he did some truly outrageous things, which you'll have to read about, he never reneged on a debt. He said, I will provide the money for the Jeannette expedition, and he did, right up to the very end of the expedition. In any case, let's go back and take a look at George DeLong. George DeLong gained some notoriety on a trip along the Greenland coast where there were 19 survivors of another thing, a Polaris expedition, who needed help. And he went through this, and on that cruise, he fell in love with the Arctic and decided that he was going to somehow, one way or another, lead an expedition into the Arctic. So let me tell you about George DeLong. He was America's newest Arctic hero. He was a young man of many talents and deep contradictions. His wife, who you'll hear about in a little bit, Emma DeLong, thought that there was within her husband an incessant friction, a contrast between impetuosity and patient striving, between a love for adventure and a compulsion to accomplish something ambitious and sustained. DeLong could be a romantic, sometimes an extravagant one. He had what Emma called a hungry heart, but he willingly confined himself for most of his life to a straitjacket of absolute discipline. He knew what he wanted with nearly perfect clarity, and he pursued it with unswerving conviction. Resistance only intensified his resolve. He was going to be the leader of the expedition. And there's more we can say about him, but let's move on ahead. As I said, there are many stories here, and the story that I want to tell you about, in addition to just simply mentioning Gordon Bennett, and I will mention another person later on, I want to tell you about the love story between George DeLong and Emma. George DeLong was 24 years old. He had been in Paris for a weekend, and then he went to Le Havre, where he attended a dinner party at the home of a very successful American steamship magnate named James Wotton. Captain Jimmy, as he was known, was part owner of the New York and Havre Steamship Company, and he and his wife Margaret had a large family and lived in a mansion high on a hill, and so on and so forth. On the evening of this dinner that George DeLong was invited to, he became entranced by the Wottons' daughter, Emma. Emma was 17 years old. George was 24. He fell in love with her instantly, and within 2 or 3 weeks asked her to marry him. Well, she was a little bit troubled with that. she said that she took a liking to him, but he was a little too aggressive, is the word she used. She later put it, noting, evidently he intended a conquest. Well, he was a naval officer, and so he was sent off to different expeditions and so on. But he constantly came back to Le Havre to see if he could persuade Emma to marry him. And she did. One of the things that Sides does, as the expedition gets going, and we'll talk about that in a minute, as the expedition gets going, she writes letters to George DeLong. And she makes multiple copies of them, and that's the only way to do it in those days, was to write the same letter 3 or 4 times. And she made sure that they got put on cargo ships going on up into the area that the Jeanette was in and so on. And so those letters were all saved. They were in that trunk that you heard about. But in any case, I'm going to skip over this a little bit. He wrote her a letter, and I'm going to read that letter to you. And this is after they're up there in the Arctic. It said, "We are now hoisting the last of the supplies and shall leave at 7 o'clock this evening," from a port they were in Siberia. The weather is beautiful, light southerly breeze and smooth seas, and I am anxious to be off, and yet it seems like saying goodbye once more. They had already said goodbye in San Francisco when the ship went up there. However, I am in this thing, and I am going to see it through. Goodbye with 1,000 kisses. With God's help, I shall yet do something to make you proud of bearing your husband's name. Do not give me up, for I shall one day or another come back to claim my wife and child. He has a daughter. May God keep and bless you wherever you are, and save your love for me. If by any mischance we should never meet again in this world, be assured that in everything, word and deed, you have always been to me the truest, best, and most loving wife a man ever had. My whole heart and soul go out to you, my precious darling. Goodbye. That's the last word she gets from George DeLong. But she writes letters on a regular basis. And Hampton Sides puts these letters in critical places in the book, so that you know they were written about the time the events you have just read about happened. My own dearest husband, I have this is June 12, 1881. They left in 1879, so they've been up there for a while. My own dearest husband, I have such a strong feeling that I will see or hear from you this summer I can hardly wait. May God bless and preserve you wherever you are and bring you back safely and all those with you. Remember me to my friends of the Jeanette. She got to know them very well. I dare not say on the Jeanette, for she may be at the bottom of the ocean, and you may be struggling for your lives in boats or on the ice. Never mind, darling, I will bear up under any circumstances and will meet you with open arms however and whenever you return. And I think I should read the last letter that she wrote. All this will be forgotten when we meet again. It will seem only as a bad dream, a fearful nightmare that has been successfully passed through. However dangerous your surroundings are at present, I can still trust God and hope a little longer. I often dream of you, and you seem all right, only sad and not as strong as you used to be. Oh, darling, I cannot show you my love, my sympathy, my sorry for your great suffering. I pray to God constantly. My own darling husband, struggle, fight, live. Come back to me. Now that's the love story that Hampton Sides has managed to make this part of the book. Constantly through the book, that love persists. And Emma, as we learn later, is critical. She becomes the DeLong expedition. I failed to mention that after they got the ship in Le Havre and they were fixing it up, she and her daughter sailed with them all the way around the Horn on up to San Francisco. Took something like 16 months or something like that. She said it was the happiest time of her life. And so she knew the folks on the Jeanette, she knew the crew, she knew the officers and so on. And so she feels very close to it, and he felt that she was very close to it. He felt that she was almost an officer of this. Well, DeLong has got the ship, he's got the money he needs. They sail it around to San Francisco Bay, to Mare Island, and the Navy begins to take over and strengthens the ship. And they almost rebuild the thing, but they strengthen the ship. He recognizes that they're going to need it. They're going to have to get through the ice in order to get to the open ocean, which is around the North Pole. So it's in good shape. He loved the ship from the moment he saw it. This idea of an open polar sea was such a popular idea. There was a probably the most famous geographer in the world at that time, a man named August Petermann, who lived in Germany, and he believed it. He was absolutely convinced, built these beautiful maps that showed open ocean at the North Pole. He was absolutely convinced they were going to do it this way. There was also a man named Silas Bent who had been in that area, and he was convinced of it as well. And he wrote an article in Putnam's magazine that DeLong read, and it told you exactly how to get to the North Pole. And why hadn't this happened before? Well, before, most of the explorations had been by the English, by the British. And they had gone up through by Greenland and so on, and tried to get there that way. And of course, they never did. And there are all sorts of famous things that happened there. But in any case, this combination of Bennett and DeLong, it was obvious they were going to do it. And there was absolutely no doubt. And so in George DeLong, his first job, is, in addition to taking care of the ship, was to assemble a crew. And some of the folks had been with him, and so he thought, well, he assigns as executive officer a man named Chip, Lieutenant Chip, who had sailed with him around the Horn and so on. He's going to be the executive officer. The crew that he's going to put together will have 5 officers, 3 civilians who have special expertise, and then 25 crewmen and cooks and so on and so forth. And so he assembles them, and there are several heroes in this story, and one of them is a man named George Wallace Melville. George Melville is related in some distant way to Herman Melville, but that's irrelevant to this story. Whereas DeLong was a graduate of the Naval Academy, Melville is a graduate of Brooklyn Technological Institute, or whatever it was called in those days, and he grew up in Brooklyn, as did DeLong. So Melville had served with DeLong on some other occasions. DeLong says, we got to have George Melville as the chief engineer on this cruise. I'm going to read to you what Hampton says about him right here. George Melville would serve as the Jeanette's engineer. Said to be distantly related to the great author Melville, was an improvisational genius with machines, a greasy-fingered savant who seemed most at home among thumping boilers and sharp blasts of steam. The engineer, 38 years old, had a booming voice, a stout physique, and an enormous bald head. You'll see that in a minute. Like an egg that was too big for its nest. That's George Melville about the time of the cruise. He was a native of New York City, liked DeLong. He had been raised in Brooklyn. Melville cursed in torrents, but eschewed drinking, gambling, and most other vices. He had distinguished himself in both the Boston and New York Navy Yards, had become an expert on torpedoes, and had sailed on various warships, several times with DeLong. All told, Melville had spent more than a third of his lifetime afloat. He was proficient in mineralogy, zoology, and many other subjects. Later on, as they get into the cruise, DeLong will say, as long as George Melville is healthy, I'll do okay. He was clearly one of the great leaders. Another one, who I'm not going to read to you about, was the surgeon who went along. This is a man named Ambler, and he was a Navy surgeon. And the things that happened on the Jeanette cruise required somebody like Ambler to be with him. But on one occasion, for example, after they're iced in, which we'll get to, people begin to show strange symptoms, and they don't know what they are. They discover they're all suffering from lead poisoning. And as in many, many cases, it's the canned tomatoes that are doing the job on them. The tomatoes create an acid that somehow gets to the solder that holds the cans together, and these people ingest it and have all sorts of problems. Well, Ambler figures out what it is and manages to get it and so correct it and so on. They're all set. They're going to leave San Francisco, and they leave on the 8th of July, 1879. 1879. They leave on the 8th of July, and there are some things which delay them a little bit. I won't go into those. When you read the book, you'll see what they are. It puts them behind schedule. And as they're sailing up, and they're very close to an island called Herald Island, on the 7th of September, and I'll read that to you, they get nipped. Anybody know what nipped means? Well, the people who read the book should know what nipped means. In any case, on Sunday, September 7th, the men felt a new pressure working on the starboard side, and then suddenly a large floe shoved the Jeanette onto a shelf of ice, causing her to list crazily. Other floes tightened around the ship. Under the pressure, her timbers began to tick and groan, and within minutes the Jeanette was completely imprisoned. Her overtaxed steam engine wheezed, and her stack spat thick plumes of smoke, but she couldn't budge an inch. The ship had been nipped, as the old Arctic whalers put it in their profession's curious lexicon of understatement. And when it was iced in, it tilted 12 degrees. Dannenhauer, who is one of the officers, he says, where is it here? The Jeanette remained cocked at a queer angle so that the men could not stand straight or sit normally or lie in their bunks without fear of rolling out. The ice was still settling, burbling, releasing bubbles of air, collapsing on its own pockets and voids, but it was turning into cement. They were locked in the ice. DeLong looked over the pack and tried to think where he could have gone wrong. His water thermometer readings had shown no evidence of warm water current pushing north. Where was the Kuroshio? The thermometric gateway, as it had been called, if it existed, certainly wasn't here. The open polar sea seemed farther away, than ever. As far as the eye can range is ice, DeLong wrote. Not only does it look as if it had never broken up and become water, it looks as if it never would. It would take an earthquake at least to get us out of our besetment. They're locked in, they're iced in. They will be iced in for 22 months with a ship that's tilted. You wonder whether one leg is going to get longer than another. And during that 22 months, can you imagine a ship with 142 feet long, 25 feet wide, with 33 men on it, getting along with each other? They have all sorts of problems. They had the lead poisoning, which I already mentioned. The ship begins to leak. And so two of the seamen go down there and stand in this icy water, bailing it out, passing the water on up, and they're bailing it by hand. And then Melville says, we don't want to do it this way. I can create a pump that will pump this water out. And he does. He can almost make anything work. Dannenhauer, who just mentioned this about the ship leaking and so on, Dannenhauer had dementia before he signed on. And Ambler, the ship surgeon, we can't take this guy. I mean, he's going to be a detriment to the whole cruise. But Dannenhauer had some people in Washington, D.C. who had a little clout. And so they made sure that he went. Well, Dannenhauer, Ambler knew what was wrong. Dannenhauer had syphilis. And the syphilis got to his left eye, and he began to lose sight in the left eye. Now, he's the navigation officer. Want a navigation officer with one eye? Well, that's what's happening. And incredible story. Ambler, who is not an eye surgeon, does surgery on the guy's eye without any anesthetic. So you have a problem with two guys, one the surgeon, doing this very sophisticated surgery, and the patient gritting his teeth and living through that awful surgery. Well, that's one of the things that's happening during these 22 months. Some of the people would think what's worse was the fact that the guy who was supposed to be our science officer was a civilian who was also a journalist for Bennett, a guy named Collins, Jerome Collins. Collins is a punster. He cannot avoid puns. Well, now, for 2 days, you can put up with that. But for 22 months, and almost everybody on the ship wants to kill the guy. Well, Collins, he's a civilian. He's not used to the Navy way of doing things. He's not used to DeLong, who in many ways is a martinet, who insists, I give the orders and you follow the orders. And to some extent, he's very much like Bligh was on the Bounty. But in any case, Collins falls out with largely with Melville first, but he has problems with DeLong too. What Collins could, and Melville begins to do things that Collins was supposed to do. What Collins could see was that Melville had usurped his role. Hurt and resentful, Collins increasingly withdrew to his room, and he began to flout DeLong's rules. DeLong had insisted that everybody get out on the ice every day and exercise. He had everything pretty well worked out. Collins would not go out and exercise, and he refused to let Ambler examine him for the monthly medical report. He would sleep late, smoking through the mid-morning, dawdling with his chores. With each passing day, he became more marginalized. Well, that's the kind of problem that you may have with you have 33 men of different dispositions on this locked-in ship. Well, they're on there for 22 months. And then around midnight on June 14th, 1881, the end of 22 months, something momentous did happen. While most of the men slept away the bright polar light, the ice opened with a ragged crack, and the Jeanette slipped into the water. And they think, great, we may be getting out of this thing. And then in no time at all, the ice begins to move in again. And it gets worse. It's making all sorts of noise. It's bending the deck and so on. Anyway, they take DeLong gets down on the ice with one of the seamen, a guy named Dunbar, who was a civilian who had been a whaler at one point, and Dunbar was the ice navigator. He was the one who knew what the ice was about to do. And so he and DeLong go down on the ice, and so he's down there with Dunbar, and he surveyed the situation. Well, the captain asked, what do you think? Dunbar's tone was grave. She'll either be under the floe or on top of it by tomorrow. And then comes the call. Finally it came, the call they had been dreading, but preparing for off and on for a long time, for many months. Abandon ship! Abandon ship, DeLong yells. And so they all go down onto the ice where they have set up camps. They have moved stuff down on the ice. They're ready for this. They knew it's going to happen. DeLong had prepared them for it and so on. DeLong is very upset. It's his ship. He found it. He saw the construction of it, the strengthening of it. He led the cruise. He loves the ship. It's a thing. It's an emotional thing with him. And he seemed to want a few moments by himself on the dying ship, and he does this. His disappointment bordered on self-reproach. Quote, "It will be hard," he wrote, "to be known hereafter as a man who undertook a polar expedition and sunk his ship at the 77th parallel." We're trying to get to the 90th parallel. I fancy it would have made but little difference if I had gone down with the ship. And he hung around a little bit longer in silence, and finally DeLong waved his bearskin cap in sad salute and called out, "Goodbye, old ship." And he jumped down on the ice, and he said nobody else is to set foot on that ship. It was his ship. So now they're on the ice. They're about 1,000 miles from Siberia. They know where they want to go. They want to go to a place called the Lena Delta, because they have this map that this great cartographer, this great geographer, Peterman, had put together that shows the delta with all sorts of villages and places where ships would be sailing and so forth. It's the north coast of Siberia. The Lena River is a major river, and it has this delta which is very, very big, about 3 times the size of the Everglades, supposedly. And so they start the trek. And what DeLong did, very wise, he divided the crew into thirds, had an officer in charge of each one, and they moved everything. And sometimes they couldn't move everything at once, and they had the boats. They had 3 boats. You're going to hear about the boats in a minute. Had 3 boats. Sometimes they couldn't move, so they had to go back and pick up more stuff. And so they might, for moving one boat 1 mile, they might have to walk back and forth something like 12 or 13 miles. Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And so anyway, they're on the trek. They're going across the ice. You saw the ice when you came in. It's like that. They send Dunbar ahead, and Dunbar kind of plots the course and puts black flags down for them. That's the highway that they're going to follow. In some cases, they have to chop off the tops of ice and make a roadway. In other places, they're going to find a way around it. So it's not a straight shot. It's a straight shot if you count where they end up but not all the way they go. So they do that. And at the end of each day, said Melville, the men were utterly fagged out. Some fainted from exhaustion, others shivered from hypothermia, having plunged into the frigid water. DeLong, who often chose to assume the harness with his men, had these things, and they acted like mules, pulling the boats along and so on. Said that a more tired and hungry set of mortals could not be found. Every bone aches. Dannenhauer, echoing the captain, noted that each day every man, quote, voted this the hardest day work he had ever done in his life. And these are hardworking sailors. So they're dragging the boats and all their equipment across the ice. They're trying to get to some place where those boats are useful in the ocean on the north coast of Siberia. So they're doing that, and they go through a series of islands called the New Siberia Islands, which are not very far from the Lena Delta, and they rest there for a while, and then they decide, okay, we're going in 3 boats. They have 3 boats. DeLong's boat, the first called a cutter, was the most stable, but he would be carrying the most men, 14 all told, and the largest allotment of provisions, in addition to all the expedition's logs, papers, and scientific specimens. And DeLong is very careful to make sure that they keep all of the records that they have. So he does that. And in addition to all it's on. DeLong's cutter was 20 feet 4 inches. 20 feet 4 inches. Some of you sitting about there, from you to the wall is about 20 feet 4 inches. Okay? That's the big cutter. And as he says, he's got 14 men altogether. The next boat is a whaleboat. Now, the difference between a whaleboat and a cutter is the whaleboat is pointed on both ends. And that was for when they were going after a whale, they could maneuver and so on. And the whaleboat is even bigger. The whaleboat is 24 feet. So add another 4 feet to that. And sharply pointed at both ends, she was made for the strenuous action and quick maneuvering required for harpooning whales. At 24 feet 4 inches, the whaleboat was the longest of the 3 and also the fastest when under full sail. That becomes a factor. The biggest worry they had was that the executive officer, Chip, is in the small cutter. And the small cutter is a little bit more than 16 feet long. 16 feet. He's got 8 men. We had a canoe that was 17 feet long. So figure 16 feet and jam 8 men into it with supplies and so on. By far the smallest of the 3, she was only 16 feet 3 inches from stem to stern. The second cutter was soundly built, but had trouble in heavy seas. It was slow. So anyway, they're at the edge of the island. They're not far from the Lena Delta. And the next step is to make that move into the ocean. So line up there. I don't know what the next slide is going to be here. Oh, that's Emma. Have you seen Emma? Did I show you this one before? Well, she continues to write letters to him. This is actually from the log that DeLong actually wrote. That's his handwriting. Done in 1880. If you're interested in this, all of his logs have been digitized. You go to www.archives.gov and you can read them yourself. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But in any case, things are beginning to, the weather is beginning to change. And DeLong sees it and he says, we've got to go quickly because I think we've got a storm coming. Now, when Hampton Sides tells you about his book, he said, that's as far as I'm going to take you on the journey of the Jeanette. I'm not going to tell you what happens after they put the boats in the water. I have a problem because my wife and Carol Mason have said, you got to tell them. You got to tell them what happened. So I don't know what to do. In any case, I'm going to make it very brief. The small cutter is lost. It has never been found. Chip and his men are gone, as is the boat. So that leaves DeLong with 14 men and Melville with 11 men. And they're making it toward the delta. Now the delta is huge, and I'm sorry I don't have a picture of the delta to show you. And they get separated. And what they have always tried to do is to keep the boats together so they all knew where they were. But they have separated. And they are probably 100 miles apart when they land. Well, some survive and some don't. But they all know that once they get to the Lena Delta, they got it made. Because there are little villages all over the Lena Delta with people who are going to save them. And that's Peterman's map. Peterman never went out. He sat in his armchair and he took reports from the people who were out exploring. And he made maps from what they told him. And so these guys, once they get to the Delta, they said, oh great, there's a little village over here. We get there and they'll take care of us. The little villages are run down one hut. And that's what they have to rely on. And what do I tell you? 13 survive out of 33. Why haven't you heard of the Jeanette expedition? It was a major, major event. At the end of the year, that's an artist, that's a little bit better than the one I did. That's an artist painting of, it was done in 1883. The Jeanette sunk in 1881. But that gives you some idea what things were like. And this was from the New York Herald in December of 1881. By this time, word had gotten back. We've lost these people. The ship has been crushed, and so on. And it shows the track of the trek across the ice. They get up to the New Siberia Islands. This map is wrong because they go through the New Siberia Islands and actually stay on one of the islands before they make the run to the delta. And this is the delta here. That's the delta right there of the Lena River. In any case, this was a very famous event. They built a monument to it on the campus of the United States Naval Academy that talks about the Jeanette and so on. On the table over here, there are some resources that you might want to refer to. There is, at this end, as I look at it, a book called In the Lena Delta, which was written by George Melville and published in 1884, 3 years after the end of the expedition. So that tells you that Melville was one of the survivors. Melville, in my judgment, they couldn't have done it without him. Anyway, Melville, just to get ahead of the story, Melville goes on to become the engineer of the Navy. He retires as a rear admiral. He completely revises the United States Navy and changes it from wooden ships to metal ships, all sorts of fancy equipment and so on for the time. Under Teddy Roosevelt, the fleet, brand new ships, goes all around the world showing off that now we have a Navy. So anyway, that's a source. Emma survives. She lives till she's, I don't know, she's in her 90s, I guess. She has a small farm in New Jersey or Pennsylvania. And she learns how to farm and does a better job than the farms around her and so on. She, as I mentioned before, is sort of the personification, the what do I say, the spokesperson for the DeLong Jeanette expedition after her husband is gone. And she publishes all of his journals, edits them and so on. And then in 1938, she puts out her own memoir. It's called Explorer's Wife, and it's available. Melville's book is available now, and then all the digitized stuff is available. These are the things that Hampton Sides used to come up with this book, In the Kingdom of Ice. Now that's where my discussion of this would stop. But it's not the end of the story. 3 years, 4 years after the ship sinks, the Jeanette sinks, somebody finds something that is clearly from the Jeanette on the south tip of Greenland, all the way across the Arctic Ocean. I don't know whether I can get back to that or not. Where is it? Bear with me a minute.
Time, John. Time, Dad.
The Jeanette sinks somewhere over here. And in 4 years, this stuff, which happens to be a pair of pants that DeLong had with his name in it, ends up down here. Now, a graduate student in Norway named Fridtjof Nansen. Yeah, I gotta quit. Shirley says it's time. Fridtjof Nansen sees this. He says, hey, the way to get to the North Pole is to build a ship that's not going to collapse, put it in the ice where the Jeanette was, and the ice will drift across, and that'll take you to the North Pole. So he does that. Norwegians build a ship called the Fram, and so on and so forth. A ship does make it to the North Pole. That's the Skate. That's the second nuclear submarine. It was beat to the North Pole by the Nautilus a year earlier. A book called Nautilus 90 North by Commander Anderson. They couldn't get through the ice. The Skate a year later did get through the ice, as you see here. Well, I won't say that's where the story ends, but that's a pretty good place to close it. But I do want to close my comments to you with something that happened on New Year's Eve, 1880. They're on the ship, they're jammed in the ice and so on, and they had this celebration New Year's Eve. On New Year's Eve, 1880, when DeLong stood up in front of the men, he tried to convey some of the hope that drove and animated him each day. He'd never been very good at speeches, and he had nothing planned. He puffed his pipe for a while, I smoked the pipe, drinking in the mood of the night, and he then began. Like every event in life, this cruise may be divided into two parts. That which has been, and that which is to be. We are about to turn our backs on the old year and turn our faces toward the new. During the past 16 months, we have drifted 1,300 miles. Danger has confronted us each day. We have been squeezed and jammed, tossed and tumbled, nipped and pressed until the ship's hull would have burst had it not been as strong as the hearts it held within. We have pumped a leaking ship for a year and kept her habitable, and we are still all here. We face the future with the firm hope of doing something worthy of ourselves and worthy of the flag that floats above us. We are not yet daunted. Thank you very much.
I think what we'll do is to come up.
I think instead of the general question and answer period, since we're running a little bit late, if you have a question, come on up here and talk to John directly. Thank you.
And don't feel daunted.
Undaunted courage.